So let's go ahead and finish up chapter 20, getting into the lungs, breathing, and their development. So we're going to talk about their overall function, the blood supply to the lungs, and then how the lungs are kind of encapsulated and the functions of that. And then we'll get into how breathing works and development of the lungs. So we look at the gross anatomy of the lungs. We don't want to just say lungs, right? We also want to get into the smaller parts. How do we distinguish lungs from each other? So we have the right lung, we have the left lung, and each of these are going to be slightly different. So if we look at the right lung, we notice we have 3 lobes, a superior, a middle, and an inferior. And between those lobes, we have what are called fissures. So we have the right horizontal and the right oblique fissures. On the left side, we only have 2 lobes, though. We just have the superior and the inferior lobe, and then we have the left oblique fissure. We also have if you're looking kind of towards the middle, you notice that left lung kind of carves in on itself. That's going to be forming what's called the cardiac notch. And based on the name, it can tell us exactly what's going to go there, right? The cardiac notch, what do you think that's making room for? The heart. But the lungs are not alone. They're very thin, sensitive tissues. We have lots of stuff that's going to help provide some protection to these, including the pleural sacs. So we have we're going to be found within the pleura, which is going to be our membrane providing that protection. With that, we have both the parietal and visceral pleura. Remember, parietal is going to be closer to the body wall, visceral is going to be closer to the organ, with the pleural cavity in between. We have the ribs providing protection, as well as the intercostal muscles in between those ribs as well. And then down below it, right below the lungs, we'll have the diaphragm as well. We'll talk about the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles in just a second when we get into breathing. Now, on occasion, things can go wrong, especially if there's an injury to these pleura to the point where air is able to get into them. That can cause what's called pneumothorax or tension pneumothorax. Basically, the pressure inside that cavity has increased to the point where the lung cannot expand properly and is collapsed in on itself. The way that I know to treat this is through a catheter system, needle chest decompression, which involves putting a large needle in between the ribs, puncturing into that pleura. It has a catheter that has a one-way valve to allow any sort of air inside that area to escape, but it will not allow air to get back in, allowing the person's lung to actually, expand properly. Let's go ahead now and get into the processes of the respiratory system. We're going to talk about what drives pulmonary ventilation or breathing, talk about the relationship between pressure and volume and respiratory rate, and then we'll talk about ventilation and some different types of respiration. So let's talk about the different things, the different processes that are part of the respiratory system. One is pulmonary ventilation. This is just the act of breathing to get air in and out. So your chest expanding, right, your diaphragm moving down, the ribs moving up and out, those actions that allow air to move in and out. External respiration, this is going to be the gas exchange that happens in your lungs. And I know that seems weird because when you think external, you think outside. It might help to remember external respiration as the contact with the external air. Even though it is in your lungs, the air is coming from the outside. Transport of gases, this is going to be just transporting oxygen, carbon dioxide via the bloodstream. And then internal respiration, this is going to be the exchange done between the bloodstream and the tissues. So pulling up the waste, pulling up the carbon dioxide created by the tissues and putting that in the bloodstream, and then giving the tissues the oxygen from the blood. And then cellular respiration, this is what's happening in like the mitochondria, right, deep inside of a cell, where they're using that oxygen to produce ATP. Now, in terms of inspiration, expiration, again, it doesn't mean that we're inspiring or that something bad's happening. All we're doing is talking about breathing in and breathing out. Inspiration, breathe in. Expiration, breathe out. When you inspire, right, when you breathe in, there are a few actions that are going to happen. Your diaphragm is going to contract, and when your diaphragm contracts, it's going to flatten down towards your belly. Your intercostal muscles will also contract, which is going to lead to your ribs moving up and out, right? So if you take a deep breath, right, and it might be helpful to do that right now, kind of feel the action, right? But you can kind of feel, right, and especially with the ribs, you can almost see it if you look in a mirror. You can see your chest kind of expand. And then as you exhale or go through expiration, you see the opposite occur. The diaphragm is going to relax, going back up into its C shape. And the ribs are going to move down and in as the external intercostals relax. This is changing basically the volume of the thoracic cavity. As you're breathing in, right, as you're moving the diaphragm down and the ribs up and out, you're creating more volume in that chest. When you go to exhale and your diaphragm relaxes back up and your ribs move down and in, you're shrinking that space, you're losing volume. That's what's going to allow us to breathe in and out, is the creating of more space and then the removing of that space. Now, in some cases, someone may have trouble breathing because of some sort of condition. There's a laundry list of different conditions. It can include things that you're born with, right, that maybe are genetic, like cystic fibrosis. It can include things like that are due to environmental exposures. So certain fibroses can develop in the response to inhaling things like silica or asbestos. It's a reason why proper protective gear is so important in people who work with things like concrete, so to speak, or with insulation, right? Fiberglass, things that the dust particles can be breathed in and be very dangerous. So if you do projects like that, you should wear proper PPE. And then sometimes it can be because of something like COPD, which can develop in response to an activity that someone may have participated in, like smoking. So in this case, with COPD, we have destroyed some of those air sacs. So our lung capacity, our ability to breathe in is not as good. Those air sacs have basically broken and have combined into bigger ones, which you're like, okay, well, you still have the same amount of space, but the surface area is less, right? Because with a lot of small sacs, there's a lot of surface area for the volume. But when you destroy some of those sacs to create big ones that are kind of blended together or fused together, the volume is the same, but the surface area has decreased. And the surface area is what's important for doing that gas exchange. So this person would have a harder time breathing. They would have a harder time getting oxygen from the air that they breathe. And so they would have less oxygen available, which can lead to issues like fatigue, being tired, right? Because they're not able to get enough oxygen to do just their regular activities. Lastly, let's get into embryonic development. We're just going to create a brief timeline of how the respiratory system develops. We'll talk about the fetal breathing movements and then how the lungs inflate after birth. So this is the general timeline. We start with just like a tube that's around week 4. And then from that laryngotracheal tube, we start to see some branches develop, kind of budding out to form the lungs. Those will continue budding and branching, right? And separating out, what we call bifurcation, as they continue to branch until we finally have the lungs develop. And you'll notice that in blue, so the bronchioles and the bronchi are going to come from the laryngotracheal tube, and then the splanchnic mesoderm is going to be what actually forms the lung tissue.